Okay. So when you look at this first picture, I'm sure most of you are thinking, boy, he's going to tell us how to make it rain. Well, I wish I had that capability, but unfortunately, that's not in my repertoire. So instead, we're going to talk about knowing your soil, simply because that's literally the foundation of everything that you want to grow. And soil performance problems are some of the most common issues that gardeners experience. So this evening, we're going to talk about the physical characteristics of the soil and a little bit about how they contribute to some of those problems, and also offer maybe some ideas for compensating for some of those problems. So it doesn't matter what you want to grow, whether it's edible crops or ornamentals, or maybe you just want to grow trees and shrubs or some good lawn grass. If you're having some problems growing anything at all, and it's obviously not a pest or a disease problem, then maybe you need to take a closer look at your soil. Because to be healthy, all plants need four things. They need sunlight, nutrients, water, and oxygen. And three of those four needs come from a good, healthy soil. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, oh, wait a minute. Plants need oxygen and it comes from the soil? Well, the answer is yes and yes. Every living cell and every plant needs oxygen to survive. They use it in the metabolism of their food. So oxygen is especially important then to the roots of the plant, which are in the soil, and the roots have to get their oxygen from the soil. And of course, you know that if you grow healthy roots, you have a much better chance of growing a healthy plant. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening is healthy soil. We're going to talk about what it is, how to recognize it, and also talk about maybe some ways to improve the problems if you are experiencing those. We're going to talk about the physical properties first, and that's going to be the composition and the texture and the structure of the soil. And then we'll spend a little time talking about one of the chemical properties in the soil, specifically the pH of the soil. So in terms of soil composition, soil is a pretty complex problem or complex issue. And we can kind of describe our healthy soil using four components. That would be air, water, mineral matter, and organic matter. If we look at it graphically, what we would like to have in our ideal healthy soil would be about half of the soil would be solid matter, and the other half would be air spaces or pore spaces. And under ideal conditions, maybe not right now, but under ideal conditions, at least half of those air spaces should have some water in it. So these pore spaces, they're basically the key component of our healthy soil. That's what allows the barometric pressure to press air down into the soil, hopefully as deep as the roots on our plants. That oxygen that's in that air is what our plants need, and it also benefits the organisms that live in the soil. Now, as we said before, every living cell needs oxygen. And that means that the plants have to obtain their oxygen from the soil. But the deeper you go in the soil, normally the less oxygen is available. So that soil needs to breathe. It needs to be able to let oxygen enter the soil, and then the organisms that are in the soil are using some of that oxygen, and when they use the oxygen, they give off carbon dioxide. Well, that carbon dioxide needs to be able to exit the soil. So that breathing process is really important for our healthy soil. Now, if we ever get any rain, or if you water your soil, it's those air spaces that lets that water penetrate or infiltrate the soil and work its way through the soil to benefit our plants. But when that water enters the soil, it forces the air out of those spaces. So there's a short period of time in there, excuse me, there's a short period of time in there where there's little or no oxygen as long as those spaces are occupied by water. So that's why drainage is such an important feature. The longer the plants have to live without that oxygen, every plant variety has a different time frame that they can tolerate being without that oxygen. So without good drainage, a lot of plants will start to deteriorate really, really quickly. So the solid matter in our soil, that's the key component that basically creates structure or allows structure to be created. And the solid matter also contributes to the performance of our soil. And when I say performance, I'm talking about the nutrient that it carries and its ability to drain water properly. So looking at our component here, get my pointer going. We said we would like to have at least half of our soil volume be solid matter. So we're going to talk about two different parts of solid matter, the bulk of which is the mineral matter. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. First, I want to address the issue of organic matter. That's this smaller sliver here. Organic matter should be at least 5% of your soil bulk or volume. So when we say organic matter, what do we mean? Well, we're talking about the plant and animal matter that's in the soil. Most of that matter is going to be non-living matter. That's going to be the residue of plants and animals that used to live in the soil that are now deteriorating or decomposing and turning back into the natural elements that they're made out of. Those natural elements are a lot of the nutrients that are needed by our plants and also by the living organisms in the soil. Those living organisms in the soil then make up about 1% of the total mass of your soil. And that includes the large animals, that would be the burrowing animals that live in the soil. That would be the moles and the voles and the gophers and all those critters that we all love so much. Would also be the insects that live in the soil and their different stages of growth. Would also include the invertebrates, the worms and the reptiles and that kind of critter that lives in the soil. But the largest population of organisms in the soil would be the microorganisms. They by far and away outnumber all of the other living organic matter. In fact, just 1 teaspoon of a good healthy soil can have up to 1 billion, that's billion with a B, microorganisms in it. Now that's a lot of critters, but it's a good thing. Those microorganisms are what helps to build and maintain our soil structure. They also break down all that non-living organic matter that provides the nutrients for both our plants and for the organisms. What did I do? So the biggest percentage of our solid matter in the soil is going to be the mineral matter. Now, mineral matter basically is the non-organic particles that have been developed over like millions of years, where a weathering process has broken down a parent material, usually some kind of a rock, either sandstone or limestone or another form of rock, that breaks down over a very long period of time into smaller and smaller and smaller particles until we end up with basically 3 different kinds of particles in our soil. That's sand, silt, and clay. Of course, the sand is the larger particles. Some of those maybe are large enough that you can actually see them with the naked eye. The silt particles are much, much smaller than the sand. It takes some kind of magnification to see them. Clay particles are even smaller yet. They actually are so small that you need not only magnification, but you need a special microscope to be able to see the clay particles. So to get an idea of the relative sizes of these particles, if we took one of each particle, we had a sand particle, a clay particle, and a silt particle, and we enlarge those to the extreme so that that sand particle becomes, let's say, the size of a basketball. At that magnification, the silt particle would be about the size of a marble. The clay particle would be just barely the size of a pinhead, if that large. So this size differential between these is an important thing to understand, because they will determine how our soil is going to perform in a lot of ways. All soil is made up of some proportion of each of these 3 particles, the sand, the silt, and the clay. Now, some soils have a lot more sand in them, some soils have a lot more silt or clay. And that's why your soil could be totally different from my soil, or your soil could be totally different from your neighbor's soil, or maybe the soil in your front yard is totally different from the soil in your backyard. So there's a lot of potential variation in the types of soil, even in a very short spread of distance. So as we said, the difference in these particle sizes is what's important to understand, because they will have an effect on the performance of our soil. So what's important about the size of the particle is it's on the surface of these soil particles that the nutrients in our soil tend to collect. The nutrients don't just kind of run free and wild in the soil. They do tend to collect on the surfaces of these soil particles. So the soils that have more surface potential are generally the richer soils. They have the potential to hold more nutrients. So you would think, well, okay, so the big particles have by far and away more surface area. Well, if you're comparing one particle to another particle, that's true. But our example here shows that it would take 8 of the smaller particles, for instance, in this particular example, to fill the same space as one of the big particles. So if you measure all the surfaces on all these particles and compare how much surface they have, surprisingly enough, the small particles have, in our example, have twice as much surface area as the big particles. So what that tells us is that the smaller particles, our silt and our clay particles, have the potential to hold a lot more nutrient than the sand does. And the smaller these particles are in relationship to the big particle, the more of them will fit in that same space. So that the more small particles you get, the more it magnifies that difference. Now, it's important to point out here, I've been showing you circles and nice squares and cubes to illustrate our points on these particles. But believe me, none of these particles are squares or circles. They're all irregular, odd shapes. It's just a lot easier to draw squares and circles. So just don't think that they're all squares and circles. Okay, it's on the surface of these particles is where our roots of our plant will actually access the nutrients because they collect on the surface of the soil particles. But the important thing to realize here is they don't just absorb the nutrients like a paper towel would absorb water. They pick up those nutrients through a chemical reaction. Now, it's not important to know a lot about what that chemical reaction is. It's just important that we know that it is a chemical reaction, and we will revisit this when we get down to talking about the pH of our soil. So remember that the chemical reaction is the way these plants pick up their nutrients. So the surface area of our soil particles is what attracts the nutrients and releases those then to the plant roots. And we also know that the smaller particles has more surface area, so potentially has more nutrients. So that's why the texture of our soil is an important thing to know. So what is texture? Well, that is the relative percentage of each of these 3 kinds of particles in your soil. And the texture is what makes your soil and my soil potentially so much different, because you may have a higher percentage of sand or clay than I do, or than your neighbor does. So that's that particle size and the percentage of it in the soil that actually determines a lot of our behavior. Now, soil texture is divided into 12 different classes or different types of soil. Loam, which would be a relatively even percentage of each of the 3 particles, is the sweet spot. That's the best combination you could possibly have in your soil, is a relatively close percentage of each of the 3 soil particle types. And it takes a special soil test to determine what your soil texture is. So once you find out what the percentage of each of these particles is, you can plot that on this soil texture triangle, which is kind of a busy looking thing here, but it's very handy because let's say you've got a 50% sand, a 30% silt, and a 20% clay. Each side of that triangle represents a scale for each of those particles. So down here, you would plot your 50% sand, and over here, the 30% of the silt, and over here, the 20% of your clay. Then you follow the diagonal lines within the triangle until the three of them come together, and wherever they meet, that will give you the texture of your soil. So as we said, it takes a special soil test to actually make this determination and give you those percentages. There's a couple of ways that I'd like to tell you about that you can kind of get at least a rough idea of what kind of soil texture you have. And the first way would be the old farmer way of doing it. Is just grab up a handful of soil and put enough water in it to make a little mud ball. And you start working that mud ball between your finger and your thumb and making a ribbon out of it. As you're doing that, if you have a high sand content, you're going to feel that grit. It's going to be very obvious. You won't be able to make a ribbon out of it because it's going to fall apart as soon as it leaves your finger. So if you have a high silt content, instead of feeling the grit, it's going to feel pretty smooth. It's going to be more like a flour texture. And it'll stay together long enough to make maybe a short ribbon, okay? Now, if you have heavy clay soil, like I do, what you find is that it's going to feel sticky. It's going to leave stains on your hand, and you're going to be able to hold it together for a long time, and it's going to make a long ribbon. So that's a quick, very unscientific way to get a kind of an idea of what your soil texture is. Now, there's another method that will give you a little better idea of percentages. Again, it's pretty simple and it's not thoroughly accurate, but it'll at least give you an idea. It's called the jar test. And that's where you would take a sample of your soil, dry, and sift out all the big pieces of debris and rocks and large pieces of organic matter. Fill a jar about a third full of that soil. Then you add clean water up to maybe about 2/3 full of the jar. You want to leave some space at the top because you're going to add some powdered dishwashing detergent. Now, it's important that you use powdered detergent and not liquid. The liquid detergents tend to make way too many suds. So add your powdered detergent, put the lid on it, shake it up real good, and make a slurry out of that. Then set it on a level surface someplace where you can leave it for a while. And these particles will start settling out. So sand being our heaviest particle, it's going to be the first thing that settles out. So it'll make a layer in the bottom of the jar. So after just 1 minute, the sand will have settled out of this mixture. So without picking the jar up and moving it, use a felt tip and make a mark on the jar to mark the depth of that first layer. That'll be your sand layer. Then after 2 hours, you'll have a second layer. That'll be the silt particle. So make another mark for the depth of that second layer. Then after 48 hours, that's why it's important to set this jar someplace where you can leave it for a while. After 48 hours, finally, the clay will settle out of it. So you mark that third layer. Then you can measure the total height of all 3 layers plus measure each individual layer. Then by dividing the individual layer number into the total height, that'll give you a percentage or you divide the layer by the total height, and that will give you a percentage for each layer. Then after you have your percentages, you can plot them on the triangle. Now, if you want to do this soil test, I really recommend that you go to this website, which is a Clemson University website. They have a lot more detailed instructions and other information that would be important to you. But it's a good way to get a rough idea of what you have for soil test, soil texture. So after you have your percentages, you can plot them on the triangle and tell what your texture is. Now, again, the sweet spot on this triangle is right in the center of the triangle where these loam soils are. If you have a high percentage of any one of the three types of particles, then you're going to be out into the points of the triangle, and those are the soils that potentially can be a little problematic. For instance, if you have a real sandy soil, good news and bad news. The good news is, well, these air spaces that we talked about wanting to be 50% of your soil, yeah, you can achieve that pretty easily with sandy soil because big particles are going to have big spaces between them. That's great for air infiltration. That's also good for heat convection in the spring, right at the end of when you're coming out of winter and the soil starts to warming up. Sandy soils will warm up much faster than the clay or the silt. It's also great for water infiltration because water will get into the soil real quick. So you'll have excellent drainage. And the sandy soils are a little less subject to compaction issues. Of course, the bad news is with all this good drainage and all this airspace in your soil, you're potentially going to lose more water quickly, both to evaporation and also to percolation. It's going to go through there real fast. So the water is not going to stay in that sandy soil very long. With that water moving through the soil real quick, you're also going to lose a lot of your nutrients, any of the nutrients that are water soluble or follow the water that are mobile will follow that water right on down. So nitrogen happens to be one of those that moves rather freely with the water. So you're going to leach a lot of your nutrients out of a sandy soil. Now, sand or the silt and the clay particles, they're close enough together in size that their performance is going to be roughly similar. So if you have a high content of either sand or either silt or clay, the good news is you have the potential to hold more nutrients because as we discussed, the smaller particles have total more particle surface to hold nutrients. That's the end of the good news. You're going to have some real drainage issues, which is a real common problem for a lot of gardeners because a lot of plants don't tolerate having wet roots for long periods of time. Water's going to want to puddle on there or run off real quick like because it doesn't infiltrate the soil very, very quickly. Once it gets wet, then it stays wet for a long period of time. And it'll crust over when it gets dry and it's slow to warm up in the spring. And compaction is a bigger problem with silt and clay soils. Also with clay, you get a lot of movement as you go from wet to dry. You get a lot of shrinking and swelling. So how do we improve soil texture? Well, if you have real heavy clay soil, it's real easy to think, well, gee, I just add some sand to it and fix the problem. The problem with that is Portland cement is made out of a type of clay particle. So if you add Portland cement and sand and water, you have this nice workable solution, substance. Problem with that is once that water dissipates, you have concrete. So if you add sand to clay soil and add water, it's real nice for a little while. But as soon as that water dissipates, you can have concrete. And once you have that condition, it's harder for it to actually absorb water then from that point on. So you may be creating a problem that's worse than the problem you had to start with. So the real key to improving soil texture, and this is true no matter what kind of dominant particle you have in your soil, if you want to improve that texture, you add organic matter. So that is the key to improving your soil texture. And the reason that works is because adding organic matter helps to create good soil structure. So what do we mean by soil structure? Well, that's where a few of those soil particles start to stick together and they form little aggregates. So they'll kind of stick together and they'll form aggregates. Now these aggregates, you can kind of think of them as being similar in appearance to grape nuts, the breakfast cereal, where you have the crunchy little nuggets that are all made up of much smaller particles. So this is very similar to that. So when these aggregates start forming, where all the small particles start making the aggregate, when that happens, inside that aggregate, there are small spaces between those particles. So we're creating a lot of small pore spaces in our soil. Then as the aggregates start sticking together, then you have, you create large pore spaces between the aggregates. So here we have the best of both worlds. We have small pore spaces within the aggregates, and we have large pore spaces between them. Should look something kind of like this, where it has that granular look to it. So when you have good structure in your soil, that soil tends to act kind of like a sponge. It's much better at absorbing water, and it also retains a little bit of that water because our large pore spaces allow for quick infiltration and percolation, and the small spaces then retain water. So this is the way that we create that healthy soil that we want. We want to have 50% solid matter, 50% pore spaces, and about half of those spaces full of water. And this is how we do it, is through the structure of the soil. Okay. So how do we create structure? Well, technically we don't. That's these billions of microorganisms that live in the soil do all that work for us if we're taking good care of our microorganisms. They all produce the byproducts that create the glue that makes this structure hold together. So the way we encourage them to do that is we give them the organic matter that they need for their own nutrients and for the nutrients of our plants. So they break down the organic matter. They're happy. They create the structure in our soil. So once you get that structure created, you think, well, great, problem solved. It's all over. Except there are ways that you can help to destroy that structure. Compaction is one of the probably the most common issues, where you walk on it or you run equipment over it and squeeze those air spaces together and break that structure down. That's a real common issue. Another way you can destroy that structure is through excessive tillage. If you go in with a power tiller and pulverize that ground so that it's like flour, then you have destroyed all the structure. So excessive tillage is not a good idea on your gardening areas. Now there's another condition where if you have a high sodium content in your soil, that can tend to help break down your structure as well. Now you may think, well, high sodium, where does that come from? Well, sodium, salt, basically the same thing. If you have large areas, driveway, patio, sidewalks where you use a lot of rock salt, that can add to it because that rock salt then can wash out into the soil. But there's a lot of areas where the groundwater, if you have a well and you irrigate from a well, some of the groundwater has a high sodium content as well. So you can be gaining sodium in your soil through your irrigation. So if you tend to think you might have a sodium issue and you've tested everything else and you can't figure out why you're having a problem, it might be worth having your well tested or having your soil tested to see if it has a high sodium content. And it takes a special soil test to determine that. So the sodium is something to think about as a potential problem. Not everybody's going to have that. So as we said, improving the structure, the key to that is to add organic matter. We also want to avoid compaction issues. So don't work that soil when it's wet, because especially in a clay or a silt soil, you're going to compact it very quickly if you're on it when it's wet. Don't overtill. And if you do have a sodium issue, then it's a good idea to do that soil test and determine how much of a sodium issue you have. And when you get the soil test, you will also get a recommendation that tells you how to deal with that. Okay. So our healthy soil, just to review here, our healthy soil has pore spaces. It has pore spaces that allow water and air infiltration, and they create the good drainage that our plants want. So a healthy soil has structure. That creates and maintains those pore spaces. So you'll have large spaces for air infiltration and water infiltration, and it'll also give you good drainage. But you'll also have small spaces then to retain some of that water. So a healthy soil also has organisms that create that soil structure. And they also release the nutrients from the organic matter that's in the soil for both the nutrients and for the plants. So organic matter is kind of the foundation for our healthy soil. It provides food for the organisms, it provides nutrients for the soil and for the plants, and it also helps with water retention. Okay, do we have questions at this point, Tracy?
We do have one question, Butch, that just came in. It's, what is the best technique to add organic matter to an already existing lawn? I have a very clay soil.
Okay, and you have if you already have the lawn established where you can't till in the organic, one of the best ways to do it is to not bag your grass when you mow, because that grass has a high nitrogen and it also serves as an organic. So when you mow, if you mulch mow and leave those grass clippings, that will add some. Now, the other thing with clay soil is you can aerate and you can add some organic then after you've aerated and created the aeration holes in the soil, then those can be filled with some kind of a organic matter. Would need to be a real fine organic, okay?
So we did have another question that came through, Butch. It says, if our yard was watered with well water for many years, but we now use city water the past 3 to 4 years, is it likely the sodium level is still high from the well water?
Well, if you had a sodium problem to start with, it could be. But if you haven't had it tested or haven't had a problem, you may not have a sodium problem. I guess that I may not have been too clear there. Not everybody is going to have that just because they have a well, because not all the groundwater has the same sodium issue, just in some areas. So if you haven't been tested and not having a problem, chances are you don't have a problem.
Thank you, Butch. Those are the 2 questions we had.
Okay, thank you. I will proceed then. Let's talk about chemistry. Specifically, we'll talk about the pH of the soil. And we always see that expressed as a lowercase p and a capital H. The reason for that, of course, is the capital H is the chemical symbol for hydrogen. The lowercase p basically stands for power or potential. So it's the potential or the power of hydrogen, because it's the hydrogen atom that determines the acidity of our soil or of a solution. So pH is measured and expressed on a scale of 0 to 14. I'm just showing 2 through 12 here on my example, because the ends are so extreme that heaven forbid we should ever see that in our soil. So 7, the midpoint on that 0 to 14 scale, is neutral. A pH of 7 is neither acidic nor is it alkaline. But the numbers smaller than 7, the smaller the number, the more acidic the environment. By the same token, the bigger the number over 7 is the alkaline side of the scale, and the larger the number, the more alkaline your environment is. Most of our soils are going to be somewhere probably between a 5 and a 9 on the pH. And I might point out this pH is always expressed to the nearest 10th. So you'll have a pH of like 5.6 or 6.3 or 8.1 or 7.2. It'll always be expressed as a to the nearest 10th number. Most of our plants, and every plant or every type of plant is potentially a little different in terms of maybe the pH that they really prefer the most, but most plants are going to be happiest in the roughly 6 to 7, maybe a little over 7 pH range. Now, the important thing about this scale is that it's a logarithmic scale, so that each number on the scale doesn't just represent 1, it actually represents a power of 10. So that, let's say, for instance, 5.6 would be 10 times as acidic as 6.6. By the same token, 4.6 would be 100 times as acidic as 6.6. And that's true on the alkaline side as well. So 8.1 is going to be 10 times as alkaline as 7.1. And heaven forbid, if you had 9.1, it would be 100 times as alkaline as 7.1. So that's the important thing to know about the numbers. Now, if you remember, we talked about our plant roots pick up the nutrients off of the surfaces of our soil particles through a chemical reaction. The reason that's important to know is in chemistry, anything that occurs in an acidic environment, the acidity or the pH of that acidic environment affects that reaction. So what happens is at higher or lower pHs, some of those nutrients that our plants need get bound up with other things and become unavailable to our plants. It's not because the nutrient isn't in the soil, it's because it has become bound up with something else and is no longer available. Probably one of the better examples of this is the situation if you have a pin oak tree or a river birch or some of the maples and maybe some of the other varieties that have a tendency to develop a condition where in the middle of summer when you have green leaves on all the trees and all of a sudden you notice that your pin oak or your river birch has yellow leaves on it instead of green. Well, that's quite often due to a condition called iron chlorosis or the unavailability of iron in the tree. It's not because your soil doesn't have iron, because most of the soil, I think, in Sedgwick County probably has plenty of iron in it. It's because your pH, normally you have a high pH when this happens, and that iron becomes unavailable. Your tree can't pick it up. And this also happens with other plants and other nutrients. This chart kind of gives you an idea. If you look here between pH of 6 and 7, say about 7.7 or 8, this full thickness of the line indicates availability, the full availability of that nutrient. But if you'll see, as the pH gets lower or higher, that availability starts to drop off. and each one of the nutrients is affected a little different way. But the bottom line is, if you have an extreme pH, I say extreme, if you have a pH that's either high or low, say lower than 6 or higher than about 7.5, then it can start affecting some of the nutrients in your soil. So if you have either a high or a low pH, of course, the only way you're really going to know that is to have a soil test done. And when you do that, you will, if you have a pH that needs to be adjusted, you will receive a recommendation on how to do that, what to add and how much. So to remedy a high pH, bring that number back down, we'll use sulfur or ammonia or ammonium nitrate or some form of sulfur, and that will bring that pH down some. If you have a low pH or a very acidic soil, then lime is used to raise that pH, to bring it closer to neutral. Now, it does take a soil test to determine for sure what your pH is. And it's important to realize that adjusting soil pH takes time. So it's a good idea, if you're going to need to adjust it, to do it like in the fall in preparation for spring planting. So you have some time for that pH to take effect. Now, the other thing that's important to realize is that you can only adjust pH so much. You can't do a real extreme, and you can only adjust it so much at a time. So if you need to move it quite a ways, you very likely will have to do more than one application over a longer period of time. So you adjust it a little bit at a time, if you can adjust it enough to do what you want to do. Now, when you have a soil test done, it's important that you also indicate what you want to grow in that soil, so that when you get the recommendation, it's based on growing whatever it is you want to grow, because different plants have different requirements, and some may be more tolerant of a high or low pH than others. Okay. So what have we learned here? We've learned so far that texture, or the sand, silt, clay content of our soil, determines our performance of our soil, or how it plays a big part in it. We've learned that organic matter also solves problems, and that pore spaces are very important. That structure is what creates those pore spaces. And we've also learned that pH affects nutrient availability. I see we have another chat. Do we have another question in the box, Tracy?
Yes, we do. And it says, back to clay soil, is gypsum or cotton burr good to put on your yard that is already established? If so, how would it be applied?
The gypsum is used mostly, or recommended mostly, I think, if you have a high sodium issue. Gypsum doesn't add nutrients. It doesn't affect your pH. So it's going to be used mostly with a recommendation if you have high sodium content. Now, what was the other material that they've asked about?
Cotton burr.
Cotton burr?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you could add, the thing with that is, from what I'm thinking I have seen, is sometimes there's some pretty big chunks of stuff. And I mean, it's not a real fine kind of compost. So it may not work into the soil naturally on an established lawn very well. It may look like you have a lot of debris in your lawn. That would be the only thing with that. It'd be better to use something that's a much finer texture on an established lawn, I would think.
Thank you, Butch.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about soil test. So our basic soil test is basically to help you determine a good fertilization program. So what you will determine with a basic soil test will be the levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in your soil. You'll also learn your pH of your soil and how much organic matter you have. So when you order the soil test, there should have been, I think we sent some soil test information handouts along with the registration for this. So if you have those have good information, complete information on how to take that soil test, and also information about the different kinds of tests. One of the important factors in getting that soil test is that it needs, or it has to be, a dry soil sample. So right now, that's not a problem. But there have been times where we've actually had some rain that soil samples would come in with still a lot of moisture in the soil sample, and those don't work. You need to have dry soil. So if you have wet soil when you take the sample, then you want to spread it out on a newspaper or something and let it dry naturally. Don't force dry it. Let it dry naturally before you bag it and bring it in for a soil sample. You'll also, when you bring it in, part of the information that they will want is A, what kind of test you want, and B, what do you want to grow in that soil? Because this recommendation on fertilization will come with it, with the soil sample, the soil test results. And the recommendation will be based on growing whatever it is you have indicated you want to grow in. And that can vary depending upon what you want to grow. Now, there are also, besides the basic tests, there are special tests for other micronutrients. There are special tests for sodium, for soil texture, and for heavy metals. And of course, each of these will have a little different fee schedule. And I think that fee schedule is also in the handout. Or if you have a question about it, when you bring the sample in, they can quote you cost for doing the sample. So just a moment to talk about different soils and different properties. You know, we talked about how the proportion of each of the soil particles can make soils different. Well, it's kind of hard sometimes to understand when you have a lot that's maybe 60 feet wide and 150 feet deep, how you can have more than one kind of soil on a lot that's no larger than that. Well, it's because of what I call the urban effect. Of course, when they go to build a house for you on that lot, the first thing they do is dig a gigantic hole in the ground. And I love this picture because you can very easily see how thin the topsoil is. Everything below that dark streak then is the subsoil. A lot of that, it may be soil that hasn't seen daylight in centuries. Who knows? It depends on the location. But what they do is they dig this big hole, and a lot of times they're a lot small enough, they don't have room to store that dirt, and so they haul it off. Well, after they build the foundation or your basement, whichever the case may be, then they have this big gap around that concrete structure that needs to be backfilled. So they go and they haul in dirt from somewhere. It isn't necessarily anything that came from your lot, and heaven only knows where it came from. So it can be a totally different kind of soil than what you've had and the rest of your lot. Same thing would apply if you have a low spot where they have to bring in soil to bring up an area of the lot for drainage issues, surface drainage. So that urban effect, that dirt can move around a lot. And so that determines how you can have so many different kinds of soil on one property. Now, the reason that you kind of need to keep that in mind is when you're doing your soil test, if you're going to have different planting areas, you may want to do more than one soil test. So that way, if the sample that you pull in the front of the yard may be totally different than what you grow in the backyard, where you might want a vegetable garden. Or if you want to do foundation plantings around the house, that soil, especially being up next to the foundation, could be totally different than any of the soil anywhere else on your property. So it's a good idea to be aware of that, just so that you can be looking for that kind of a difference. So if you have problem areas where maybe one spot, the dirt or the soil is way too off on the pH, or maybe you have a sodium issue in one place that's not in another place, or maybe there's other issues where you can't grow what you want to grow in that spot, and it's something that can't be amended easily, then what you want to consider is doing raised beds. I think that's a good way to solve some of those issues, or to avoid those issues, I should say, where you can actually build your planting area on top of above the problem soil, and then you can build in that bed, you can build the soil that you need. So raised beds could be potentially a solution for a problem area. Now, that brings me to another problem area that has nothing to do with the soil necessarily, but it's a very common problem area. And while we're talking about raised beds, if you have a large tree, there's no doubt that you're going to have problems growing something under that large tree. It's not because of the soil, but it's more because of the lack of sunlight and all of the root competition. Because that tree, especially a large tree, is going to have a tremendous root system on it, a very efficient root system. So not too many things are going to want to be able to compete with it. So we said in a problem area, build a raised bed. Well, this is one place you do not build raised beds. If you build a raised bed over the root system of that tree, then you're almost guaranteeing that that tree is going to suffer. Because what did we say? Those roots have to have oxygen. So if you build a raised bed around this tree, and I see them all over town, you build a raised bed around the base of that tree so you can grow ornamentals in it. The ornamentals might do well because you'll fill that with good soil, but you will create problems for that tree. So don't build raised beds under trees. Instead, think about using maybe containers, choosing plants that are a little more able to compete. Some of them are better at competing than others. The biggest problem is going to be the shade issue, and we could do a whole hour on shade gardening, at least. The shade under the tree, or the area under the tree, is a special kind of problem, but just don't build raised beds under them. No matter what you grow under there, it's going to require extra care. You're going to need to have extra water, extra nutrients, and extra care for anything to do well. Well, are we down to the point where, are there any other questions?
We don't have anything posted in the chat, but let's go ahead and give it a minute just in case somebody has something they want to share real quick.
Okay, we can do that. And while we're waiting for that, I will just point out that on the screen here, we're showing the Extension Master Gardener Hotline phone number, so that if you have questions or you have issues that you need help trying to figure out what's causing what, this is an excellent resource. Hotline phones are manned from 9 to noon and from 1 to 4, Monday through Friday, all during the growing season. And then during the winter, they also have winter hours that are not quite as extensive. There's not too many people gardening here, but this is an excellent resource. So feel free to contact the hotline if you have questions, or if you have problems that you'd like to have some help figuring out, and they can get you all kinds of good information and good resources on how to solve some of your gardening problems. Hey, I see we got a number of groups.
We did get a question, Butch. What would be considered excessive tilling?
I guess when I say excessive tilling, I'm thinking of if you use a power tiller. I know I have seen people do that, where they come in with a garden tiller that is a big, powerful machine, and they just rip and go through it 2 or 3 times. I would consider that excessive. Anytime that you end up basically pulverizing that soil, you have destroyed your structure. So the way, of course, if you're doing a big area, like some people grow a very large vegetable garden, and so working it by hand isn't terribly practical. So yes, you can use a tiller, just don't get carried away with it. Don't do a Tim Allen thing and see how much you can rip it up. Just, work it as you need to work in your amendments or to aerate it and get it ready for your next plant.
Okay, so we haven't had any additional questions, but we've had a lot of incredibly positive comments, Butch. Thanks for the good information, really informative, clear, and easy to follow. Let's see, great information, thank you. So everyone really appreciates everything that you have shared tonight. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate everybody being here, and thank you all for joining.
Okay, well, since we haven't had any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and just thank everyone for participating in this evening's program. I have shared a link in the chat for a quick survey. Again, we would just love it if you would take a few minutes to complete it. We want to hear how you felt about this program, but also what additional programs you would like the Wichita Public Library to offer. Your feedback is incredibly essential to our success. If you're interested in upcoming library programs, please visit wichitalibrary.org/events for a complete calendar. And we just want to thank you again for your support of the Wichita Public Library. And thank you, Butch, for your incredibly informative, interesting program. And
thank you.
You're welcome. And that ends this evening's program. So thanks everybody for participating.